Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the La Argentina honey processed Colombia from H&S Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And H&S, based out of Laramie, Wyoming. And this coffee was featured in a blind taste test rankings video earlier this year, where it finished 4th place out of 5 H&S coffees on that day. And I feel like of the 4 coffees that were featured in that DNA altered pack, this one was the biggest afterthought, as the basil note on here was nowhere near as exciting as a coffee that was described as being both reminiscent of gochujang and one reminiscent of pizza, nor a coffee that was also a Panamanian geisha. So like a lot of other people, this was the coffee that I was probably the least excited about from that DNA altered set. And it did reflect in that blind taste test video, as this one was also a little bit more normal relative to those other coffees. Even then, it's certainly going to be interesting to see if it's stayed that way, as this right here is day 71. And once again, like the other coffees that we are discussing from this H&S series of coffees that we're reviewing, this one has been on the shelf for a bit, as it was finished a lot earlier than this day 71 mark. But given that some of the other coffees took a very extended period of time to start working on, this one right here as a result has been essentially left for us to review. Now, recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind roast profile for this coffee. So this one is listed as one of their ultralight offerings, and once again, it certainly translates into the cup itself, as you can certainly tell that this one is notably lighter than the vast majority of coffees out there, as I definitely feel that ultralight profile, and I would say that this one is a very, very light coffee by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 16, first impression, and that was that blind taste test day. And it certainly was the least notable coffee on that table, as it didn't finish first, and it didn't stand out for being overly unique relative to those other coffees, as it mostly offered just a generic citric tone with a very slight spiced quality to it. In an isolated setting, there aren't too many differences either, as after I tried it post that blind taste test video, I said to myself, it's tasting the way that I tasted when I did that blind taste test. So as a result, an okay start, very nondescript. Day 35 through the Chemex, so they did request an extended period of rest on this one, and it was offering a bit more of a sweeter fruit profile this time around, in line with the listed papaya. I still wasn't detecting any of the listed basil, as it continued to remain on the cleaner side of things with a very subtle spiced quality to an otherwise citric forward cup. Day 38 through the April brewer, and this is the first time that the coffee was offering something that was reminiscent of the listed basil, as there was a very slight herbal and vegetal quality to it this time around. Other than that, it was pretty soft and delicate at the forefront, with plenty of tropical sweetness presented in a subtle sense, and it just had a bit more depth to it this time around. Day 41 through the V60 with the higher extraction adjustments, and the coffee is much more reminiscent of some of the earlier experiences, as now it's offering a nice level of punchy fruit sweetness in a tropical sense. The basil has gone back to being much more of a subtle characteristic, as this coffee was pretty clean in general, and once again, I feel like that made for a very unexciting coffee up to this point, especially given that we're working with this coffee alongside some of the other very interesting coffees in this series. Day 44, same adjustments through the Chemex, and it's a bit more generic this time around, with an undefined profile, void of any strong characteristics off brew, rather much more of a slight vegetal aspect with some soft citrus, a bit plain this time around. But once again, this coffee, at no point would I ever say was overly dramatic. We move on to day 47, as we opted for the V60 with our standard recipe, and interestingly, this is the best that I've been to this point, as it's much better in terms of the sweetness and intensity, something I would describe as being reminiscent of a vanilla cookie with a tropical jam to go inside of it. In addition to that, some sweeter citric aspects with that slight herbality once again, so not really picking up too much of that listed basil aspect to it. Day 50 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and while the coffee is notably light, there continues to remain softness with a clean base, allowing for a bit of brightness in the pink bourbon-like sense, continuing to remain reminiscent of the tropical lemonade with a slight vanilla cookie, all presented in a slightly more delicate sense. Day 53, final notes we have through the V60 with our standard recipe, and it was the best that it had been again, in a mostly sweeter tropical citric forward profile, in line with the listed pink lemonade and papaya. The sweetness is slightly reminiscent of what I would describe as being starburst at times, with the listed basil continuing to remain a much more subtle characteristic. Slightly quick finish with more of the vanilla cookie feel to it as well. All right, so let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a handful of level 4s, so let's go ahead and start with the cleanliness level 4. So this entire series is going to be pretty interesting given that these coffees in theory are DNA altered, and as a result they're supposed to be relatively funky. And I think that they have this one scored at a level 2 in terms of the funk scale, but I think that that ultra light profile really does seem to heavily influence and impact the overall results of the cleanliness, given that this one was clean. I mean, it's delicate, it's soft, a lot of the notes in this one were presenting themselves in a well-defined sense, so I don't really have anything that can kind of take away from that level 4. Usually when we have something at a level 3, it's either because of the development being too much, or it's because the profile is a bit muddled, or it's because it's offering some undesirable characteristic. But this one right here didn't have any of that, so level 4 is where I put it. Sweetness, level 4. As I mentioned in the Banco Toratu, the Mystery Coffee League coffee review, this one just had a bit more sweetness than that, and that's why that one was toned down. I was kind of surprised at how much sweetness there was for this coffee, given that it continuously presented itself in a lighter profiled sense and subtle sense for the majority of the time. But a lot of that was presenting itself in that slightly more citric tone to it. So we'll kind of move on to that with the berry fruit there at that level 4. And the listed papaya that they have, that would be in line with the berry notes, so that's why we opted for it being there at that level 4, as there's that punchy tropical aspect to it. In addition to that, that citric fruit quality that we also have scored there at that level 4 is also part of that too, as I would say that at times it reminded me of both the yellow and strawberry starburst, and as a result those two things kind of justified both of those being there at that level 4 mark. We move on to the level 3s. We'll start with the finished level 3. I did note that in our notes, mostly because I was kind of surprised at how quickly that finish seemed to dissipate in this coffee, especially given that it wasn't overly intense to begin with. So as a result, what flavor you are getting from this coffee does seem to kind of go a bit quick in it. Acidity, level 4. Once again, not necessarily the brightest coffee that we've had in general, and it was kind of interesting that we noted and highlighted the fact that it came out a little bit more bright on one specific day. But outside of that, for the majority of the time, given that this coffee was a bit more subtle, not overly intense, I think that having the acidity toned down was a kind of interesting aspect to this one. Florality, level 3. Didn't necessarily have too much to add to that, as there was a bit of a generic citric floral tone to this one, but even then I wouldn't necessarily say that it was overly prominent to the point where it was something that we noted too often in this. Savoriness, level 3. I feel like that's probably a little high. I did mention at times there was a slightly spiced quality to it, and I suppose at times it can feel a bit reminiscent of, I would say, something a little bit vegetal, but even then, as I'm drinking this on day 71, I don't really agree with it being as high as it is, so that's kind of interesting that we put it there at that level 3 mark. I mean, we made this tasting wheel about 18 days ago, so I don't really remember what I was thinking on that, but we move on. Body, level 2, final thing worth discussing in this tasting wheel. Had a bit more texture than the Banco Toratu coffee once again, as that one didn't really seem to have a lot of it, but this one at least offered a bit more in that sense. So outside of that, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. Alright, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. Well, once again, this one came out a bit more normal, and if I'm being completely honest, I was probably a little disappointed that this coffee was as normal as it was, mostly because I really wanted that basil notes to kind of shine through a lot more than it actually did. This coffee was actually fine. It was kind of nice, especially given that the other coffees that we are reviewing in this series were really out there, really weird, really different. So once again, just like with the Banco Toratu, it was a nice change of pace, given that we were working on all of these coffees, for the most part, side by side, having something that presented itself in a much more normal sense. Outside of that, though, I don't necessarily think I have too much to add. This coffee honestly just felt a little bit too normal for me. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to if you really like a lot of those more punchy tropical qualities, and I feel like this one's a pretty nice fit, as they did present themselves in a nicely sweet sense with some actually surprisingly nice clarity. So given the ultralight profile of this coffee offering some very clean aspects to it, that's the first place I would start, as this coffee isn't necessarily going to be the most intense thing out there, but it's going to present a lot of these notes in a much more subtle sense. That's the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the La Argentina honey processed Colombia from H&S Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.